So, welcome to In Conversation With. So, this is another one of the Irish Professional Mediators organisations in conversation with those who are leaders and experts in the field of mediation, so that we can have these conversations and inspire those of you who wish to come into the profession or who are starting out in the profession, or even those of you who are old hats like myself. We can always learn something from each other. And this is International Mediation Awareness Week. So we began this series last year, and every year we're going to add, and we're going to put these videos up on our YouTube channel. So it's the Irish Professional Mediators Organisation YouTube channel. So my guest this morning is the amazing, the wonderful Tony Whatling. So Tony, good morning, first of all. So I'm going to just give a little snapshot to your background, Tony, for those of you who don't know you. And I think most mediators, in fairness, do know you. So you're a John Haynes in this world in terms of you're so well known in terms of mediation and people talking about mediation practice. So you began, your professional background was in social work, childcare, and then adult mental health, family therapy, psychotherapy, and you did area team management. So you had that sort of the social care background piece as a professional before you came into the mediation world. And then you spent 10 years as the head of social work education at Ruskin Anglia University in Cambridge. And then essentially you've had 35 years of experience as a mediator, practicing and being a consultant and a trainer in the field of mediation. And really interestingly, you have delivered culturally appropriate mediation training to over 1,400 Shia Imami Ismali Muslim mediators in Pakistan, India, Henya, Uganda, Tanzania, Syria, Afghanistan, Portugal, UK, USA, and Canada. And crucially, you're a founder member of the College of Mediators UK, and you've authored 3 books on the topic of mediation and dispute resolution. I think it's 3. Would that be right?
Yes.
Yes, thank you. And you're currently working on a new book, which is not quite mediation related, but we can talk about that later if you like. So, Tony, I'm going to start out with a question and, a statement, and then let's open up to a discussion. So one thing I loved in your book, which really resonates with me as a mediator. First, I would just say to you, you've 35 years in the space. I have 13 years in the space. And today signed up the 601st case. So I'm on 601 mediation cases so far in 13 years. So I have a lot of experience as a mediator, and I also do training. And I love this work. I love it. But one thing that absolutely resonated with me was you had a piece about, and it's my mantra, don't assume anything. And the quote from your book is, don't assume that because people look like you, they are like you. Treat every client as unique and avoid stereotypical and unconscious bias assumptions. How would you speak to that, Tony, in terms of mediators practicing?
I think, as it says, don't assume anything. I think it's about getting your mind into the idea that you may have heard this story, the new people you've just started working with, you may have heard this sort of story 1,000 times. I often think I haven't heard a new story from disputed, so I haven't heard 12 or 50 times. But for these people, it's the first time when they're telling it. And what they need from me is to respond as though, for me, it's the first time as well. I think assumptions actually at one level are pretty well inevitable. They're pretty well, in a sense, normal. I often think that, if we weren't able to make assumptions about familiar situations, we'd have to relearn them every day. So even getting up in the morning and making breakfast. So at one level, stereotypes and assumptions are functional, but they become dysfunctional when you are already assuming, because of what you're hearing, that I know this one very well, I've been here before. And in turn, there's a risk that stereotype will become a prejudice. I think what's connected with that I've been looking at more recently is bias. The assumptions so easily slip into bias. And what's even more dangerous is unconscious bias. So at one level, we may know that we have assumptions about people within a few minutes of them meeting them and them talking to us, and already our brain is thinking that, you know, we know this sort of person, we know where they're coming from, and we may well not. But the more and we often know what those are, we're aware of them. The more dangerous ones are unconscious bias. And so
I think this is the key piece. The key takeaway for me is that there are two pieces here. There's the assumption piece, which we usually have a general awareness of. And when I start a case now, and I learned a hard lesson, I think I was perhaps about 60 cases in, and I learned a really hard lesson because I made a fast assumption and started. I knew I was doing it, but I thought it was fine. I started going down a particular road, and I had completely got it wrong. And I had to actually own it in the mediation, own where I'd gone, and sort of apologize because I realized afterwards, my own self-reflection on the actual mediation was, you know what, I shouldn't have gone there. I shouldn't have gone that direction. But it taught me a good lesson that I must assume nothing. Every single case is a unique case. Every single person's story is brand new. I must treat it as brand new and not assume any of the pieces around the context until I hear it. But also the second piece is probably much more difficult for mediators. It's the unconscious bias, and we all have it. Sure. If we say we don't, that's a real problem. So it's actually just being aware that we have an unconscious bias and trying to consciously manage our unconscious bias. You know, that's where I feel co-mediation is such a powerful way of mediating. For me, I much prefer co-mediation. And I suppose that slips us nicely into the co-mediation piece I wanted to sort of touch on with you. You speak about co-mediation in your new book, and first of all, I want to talk about your new book. Here it is. So I'm recommending that everybody gets this book. It's absolutely fantastic. So it's contemporary issues and developments in the field of mediation, and you speak about the co-mediation model, and you're talking about something that the reason why I started co-mediating was to create a bi-gender model, because the majority of the work I was getting were spousal relationships breaking down or relationships breaking down. Most of the cases in the beginning were a man and a woman. Yeah. And so I just instinctively did not like the idea that there would be 3 women in the room with a man in a joint session, because I felt from a male's point of view, and they were quick enough to tell me that, this is an estrogen overload. You know? So you speak about co-mediation. What's your experience of co-mediation? Have you done co-mediation? What do you think of it?
I think that one of the most beneficial things about co-mediation is when you're a novice mediator, and you may be 2 novice mediators working together. And so there's always somebody in there to help you out if you feel stuck, or you can help if they feel stuck. So I think it's an absolute bonus and benefit for beginners and novices who are trying to find their way into levels of experience. And
I suppose, you know, from me, from the co-mediation point of view, I've really settled into a very strong way of mediating, because what happens now with the co-mediator that I work with, and you actually spoke briefly to him, Shane is my co-mediator. Yeah. We strike up conversations with the clients, and each of us as mediators are in that conversation. It just is now a very natural way to mediate. But the co-mediation piece for us is that we have different competencies and we bring different skill sets into the room. I absolutely agree with you that it is a fundamental way for newly qualified mediators to learn. Yeah. And that is a model that we in our organization have adopted. We say that you need to be supervised, and that supervision piece is supervisor and or a co-mediator. So it depends which way you're going at it, but co-mediation is the model to learn, because if you work with an experienced mediator, you'll learn their way of doing it, which is not necessarily the one true way.
It is important to recognize that it's more complicated co-working than sole working. And I went through the same experience when I first trained as a family therapist. And so you still come back to that reassurance that there are two of you in the room and you can bail each other out. Well, what we discovered in family therapy was that the more experienced mediators got, the more they began to find the complexities of co-working more difficult than working on their own. And so there was this sort of inclination to move away from co-working because it's less complicated. You're in control, you're in the room, and you know what you're doing. I think, too, there's, of course, the financial element, and then it's small to have two. And I remember my first service when I started in Cambridge, we loved it for the first couple of years, and then we had our manager saying, look, we can't afford to keep paying two when you can do it as easily as one. Now, all of that leaves me thinking, it's a pity that we think about it as it being more complicated or it costing more. We should be thinking about it in terms of what does this particular referral need? What are these particular, from what we're picking up, intake process, which is typically done by one, that might suggest this could be tricky. There's a level of very high conflict, there's a potential risk of intimidation. This is a two-hander. We should put two mediators into this, two experienced mediators. So that's all. And then, of course, I think I mentioned the wonderful late Thelma Fisher was one of the grandmothers of establishing mediation in the UK 40 years ago. And she was the first one to come up with a model. Mediation. You know, and that is that you agree to begin with. You always need to agree, don't you? And that takes time with your co-worker. Who's going to lead off? Who's going to follow through and so on. But her model, which I'm sure we've got in the book, I think, is that, you know, one of them is the lead worker to begin with, and the other is the process observer.
Yeah. And I think this is a very important point for mediators who are practicing and who are doing co-mediation, that you really need to have worked out who's doing what. And because what you don't want is for your and look, I've had the experience where I've done some co-mediations that have ended up with me managing my co-mediator as well as the parties. And that's look, that's unfortunate, but it can happen. And so if you're not training somebody and you're doing co-mediation as your preferred approach, then working it out, understanding who's saying what, who's doing what is really important. Because I found that the more confident and relaxed I am, and my co-mediator is, the more relaxed the parties are, because they're trusting you.
Yes, yes. I think that's why it's so important to work out who's going to do what. And you say, what if it goes wrong? And what if I don't like the direction you're going in?
Yes.
Or you don't like the direction I'm going in. And so again, it's really good if you get to the point where one of you says, maybe this would be a good point to move on to look in more detail at where these two want to go. Now, if I wasn't ready for that, and I was just about to say something, then talk to each other and say, I think that's a good idea. However, just before we do that, I'm noticing that so-and-so is looking very anxious and quite upset. And I just want to check that out before we move on. So talk to each other.
That's really important. And one of the funniest moments I had in a trainee situation was the trainee who was co-mediating with me was so anxious to get into the joint session. It was a joint session with clients, that she would randomly ask questions, just bang, a question that, and afterwards I said to her, what do you think was the difficulty that you were having as a trainee? Because I said, I saw it, but do you know what it was? And she said, well, I just felt I really, really wanted to ask something, and I kept thinking of questions, and then I put the question in, and I said, but were you in a conversation with the clients? As I think about, if you're sitting at the kitchen table with your family and you're having a conversation about what happened that day, would somebody randomly throw a question in there out of context and out of the sequence of the conversation? And she said, no. And I said, that's what you were doing. You were so keen to come in. You were thinking of the theory of mediation and the things that you learned in your training, and trying to throw those into what should be a natural, real life dialogue and exchange.
And you just said it's out of context, it's out of sequence. That's important. I just did some assessments last week of 3 people, new trainees, on their role play. And I do this quite often. And I think the important thing is, where are we in the process? Is what sort of questions could I think of? And I'm very fond of questioning, opening the questions in particular, because that's what tends to work best in bread and butter mediation. Most of the best works don't work in a question. But there's the other thing that I want to just mention is so what? So what is a lovely expression that I took from the late John Haynes. And it's in terms of our cultural understanding of so what, which we tend to think of as tough. Deal with it, so what means, so what am I hearing from the clients? And so what are the implications of what I'm hearing? And from that, how do I formulate a good strategic question?
And you say...
And a whole process you have to go through. And so if somebody else is coming in and not in tune with where are we in the process, stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, 4, then it's going to jar. It's not going to fit. It's not going to flow.
And what it does, you're absolutely right. It not only jars, it immediately throws people back into, I'm a client, you're a mediator. It breaks the space. And you have a lovely sentence. You said questions are the bread and butter of strategic mediation practice. That's on page 165. And I couldn't agree with that more, because the questions should feel natural.
Yes.
But in fact, a good mediator, the more experience you get, the more you realize the power of questions and the power of open-ended questions, particularly when you want to explore and you want to encourage them to speak more to whatever the issues are. But you did mention very briefly John Haynes. And I noticed that you have a little bit of a standoff on how you feel about Haynes. He said emotion is emotion as an unuseful dialogue, and that he's disinclined to spend time on history discourse.
Yes.
I actually love the historical context and getting in there and getting to understand it. And you also said, you quoted someone, I love this. All conflict involves people, and so all conflict is inevitably personal. That's Randolph, 2016. So this emotional piece, it's human beings coming in with an emotional response to something, and they're going to still have that emotion as they come in. No matter, and this is something in your book that you really nailed, which is fantastic. It's not just emotion happens in family mediation; it happens in other forms of mediation, because we're human beings, and that.
Yes.
Would you like to speak to that, about how the emotional, and it leads us into the high conflict personality space as well, or the dynamic, but even just the emotional dynamic, if you'd like to speak to that first.
Yes, yeah. Yes, I mean, I'm fascinated by emotion. And it's really hard, John Haynes taught us so much, and we met so often. And it's really quite hard when your guru, you begin to disagree with him. But I think it's also very healthy. And as you say, he said, the past is not important. We say that to the clients. We're not here to talk about the past. We can't help them change the past. We can help them change the future. Emotion is unuseful dialogue, only insofar as it might tell us whether the emotion is defensive or offensive. And I disagreed with him on both of those. It's in the room. It's what they bring in with them. And they need to be able to ventilate that. They need the catharsis of getting it off their chest. And so you have choices. You have constant moments of choice. When there's a high level of emotion, you have a choice of either steering into it or steering over it. And very, very briefly, I talk about the case where there was no emotion between these two. They were separating and been married for a long time. No, obviously high emotion. I think they even said things like, we don't want to get, at each other's throats. We want to get this through as compatible as well. And we're on about session 3, including finance and property. And we were struggling with the gap between income and expenditure.
Okay.
And suddenly, for the very first time in the entire meeting we had, she exploded with rage. And she waved her finger at him and said, if you had not done what you did with my best friend, we would not be sitting here talking about our bank balance, and we would not be divorcing. Now, at that very moment, you have two choices. Just steer into it or steer out of it. And I've seen mediators who will say things like, that's very interesting. Should we come back to the figures? And I'm not going to do that. And I said, you know, that sounds to me as though there's a bit of what's going on that is still very upsetting for you, very hurtful. And you know, that's, I'm listening, I'm hearing that. Have you two ever talked about it? The it, you know, about what he did with your best friend. And the weird thing is that more often than not, they haven't talked about the it. I used to find the same in family therapy. They've done things, they've screamed, they've shouted, one of them's been kicked out, they've petitioned for divorce. And so they said no. She said no. And I said, well, would it help to spend a little bit of time just talking about what happened when that happened? And she looked very pleased and he looked terrified. So I said, and you know, to be fair, we might only need maybe 30 minutes and I'll watch the timing. But you know, do you want to try talking about that a bit? And they did, and it was really helpful, it was really unlocking. And then we were able to come back, you know, we didn't need to do much discussion about the implications of what they just talked about, but we were able to come back. And I've done that a number of times, and every time I've steered in, it's worked. So it's there, it's inevitable, it needs to be cathartic, and we can begin to move on to having a different level of conversation about where they want to be going.
And that there's another quote that you have from Hicks. You said it is obvious that emotional upheavals can lead to irrational decisions, and if you don't do as you're talking about there, dig into the emotional triggers, you won't understand, because while it might on the face of it appear to be about numbers, and yes, we do have to deal with the figures and the distribution of assets if it's a matrimonial situation, and we have to deal with parenting. But underlying all of that are the emotional reactions that people are having to this situation. And I certainly am of the school of digging in there, but I've noticed with the mentees that I have, those who have legal training are very put off by the idea of not to ask any questions. Just touching on the high conflict area, and you know, I think we'll have another conversation, because I think this is a short look today, but in the very high conflict cases, I began my mediation work, and almost all of the cases were in the high conflict space, because I got referrals from solicitors who didn't want to deal with their client because their client was presenting, but also not only were they high conflict, but they were in deep distress, because at that time there was been a property market crash, the financial disaster for many people. So I cut my teeth on most of the cases being extraordinarily volatile. So I got into the co-mediation space with Shane quite quickly after about a year, and we then began to develop a parallel mediation process, because it wasn't domestic violence based. What we were looking at was huge anger, one or both, and so putting them in joint sessions was not going to help anybody. It was going to be counterproductive, and so we would work with them separately until we got to a point where some progress had been made. If there were children, we always strongly urged them to come into joint sessions, because they had a relationship going forward. If there was no children, okay, if you really don't want to be in a joint session, maybe that's right for you two people. But I think high conflict is something that mediators, when it first comes to them, I think it alarms them. I mean, do you remember your first high conflict case?
Yes, I'm sure I do, and I remember the one that I learned most from, and that was one where I used to do some work up in Norfolk, in Ely now near Cambridge, but they needed mediators up there. And this couple were, their history of high conflict came ahead of them, with letters from lawyers saying this couple are, impossible to work with. Because of the level of their high conflict. And the short description is that she worked in a prison, and she had formed a relationship with a prisoner who was a category 1, Schedule 1 sexual offender. And the parents had a daughter. She and the father had a daughter who was with the father. And our plan was that when she came out, when the prisoner came out, they would set up home together and they would want to see the daughter. And they, true to form, they were at it as soon as they got into the room, at each other's throat. And I wasn't going to have it. I jumped on every potential inflammatory outburst and said, no, I want to remind you that we need to do this in a more civil way, otherwise it's just a little work. I kept them in their own for about 40 minutes before they both exploded and left. Now, and so happened I used to go there by train for about getting off the nice train road. And on the way back, and this is another big story here, I said, I thought, these are the clients from hell. These are the classic clients from hell. And even John Haynes couldn't solve this one. And then I thought, hang on, wait a minute, what else could you have tried? And I took a big paper out and I wrote about 8 things that I could have done differently. So now we're talking more about reflective practice. I think the best mediators have always done it, but we're only just beginning to label it as reflective practice. And I thought, well, not any one of those might have worked. But I've got to try. And next time I get a couple like this, I'm going to try those and see if it does in fact help. And so I finished up thinking, I don't like it when mediators blame clients as being the clients of help. Equally, I don't like it when mediators blame themselves.
Yes.
Well, I'm stupid, I can't do this job any longer. Because the first is, with this couple, I had not reached a point of having enough skill and ideas to work differently. And with mediators, it may be that they haven't yet acquired enough skill to be able to deal with those levels of high conflict. But it may also be that we as a profession haven't yet learned how to deal with these. And, very briefly, it's very controversial, but, if you're working with a couple where one is potentially on the borderline personality disorder, then working in a traditional way and trying to get them to think other isn't going to work. And the wonderful Joan Canning in Canada is doing a lot of work on how to work differently with
That's exactly, you're in an area, because it's something that in my professional practice with Shane, but also in my role as chair of the IPMO, is that I think it's really important not to be a precious gatekeeper to mediation, and to meet the needs of the people who want mediation. And it's up to you to figure out the best way to do that. So if you're dealing with extreme, very high conflict or domestic violence, you can employ a safe, careful way to mediate. If you have enough experience, you can. And I've done multiple cases that have domestic violence actually happening or alleged, or really serious high conflict cases that quite often are in the business world, not in the family mediation space. And I think I think you're right. It's about, we need a dialogue about what do we say are these newer, more flexible ways of working to meet the needs of because ultimately our job is about meeting the needs of people who are in dispute because they're human beings and they want our help to sort it out. Because where else are they going? To a courtroom, the most imperfect forum of all.
Yes. I did 2 things I want to pick up, and the one I missed before was even, with commercial disputes, emotion is there.
Yes.
And, as I say in the book, we tend to associate it with marriage breakdown, etc. That is plenty volatile neighborhood dispute. It is always in the room, even with high-level commercial contract breaches in international companies. They may be behaving in a very sort of formal, impressive way, but deep down somebody's very angry that their company has been compromised, their contracts have been compromised. And so it's always there. And I'm glad you mentioned Hicks, embodied conflict. It's a brilliant book. It's hard going. It's absolutely brilliant. But it is all about how the brain processes conflict. It would not have worked for me had he not then put a chapter in about how does this relate to mediation?
Ah, very good.
That's the brilliant. I don't think I would have rated the book at all because it's
If you didn't have that section.
very
Yeah,
hard.
I think Bill Eddy has written a lot about high conflict, and I think one of the pieces that really helped me was I was triggered by what I call keyboard warriors. So a client who would in person be very easy to talk to, and then they send this email from hell. And my initial reaction, and I had to change. My initial reaction was, first of all, I personally was offended. So now I'm in the conflict. And secondly, I wanted to respond to every single line of their email. And by doing that, I got back an email that was twice as long. And then I'm in a cycle of conflict with the client. So I had to learn that somebody who's a keyboard warrior, it's Bill Eddy's thing, brevity. You go back with the shortest possible response and shut it down, because otherwise you get pulled into the conflict. The piece that I want to move us to, and I'm loving this conversation, but there's some little pieces I wanted to touch on, is the minority ethnic communities. So Ireland has become a melting pot of various communities over the years. I mean, we've a huge influx of Ukrainians. We've got people seeking asylum. We've really becoming a multicultural society. But I'm very keenly aware of the fact that these minority communities are not coming into the mediation space for the most part. We do some work with other communities, but when I have, I've spoken to leaders in the Muslim community here, and they're basically saying, we don't think your mediation, and what they mean by you is the norm, the general perception of how mediation operates. We don't think it's appropriate for us. And I haven't been able to dig down into that conversation yet. And the same would go for the traveling community here. So travelers are an ethnic community, and they have actually set up the Traveller Mediation Service. And Brian, who's here, has some knowledge of this too. But this is, how do we train our mediators to become more culturally aware such that these minority communities feel comfortable coming to us and looking for mediation?
It's been such a privilege to spend 10 years working all over the world with this one particular Muslim community. And I've learned so much from doing that. You can read about these things, but, as once you're, as it were, embedded with a community which is so very different from your own, and often in very large numbers, you really begin to understand. Now, I've got into it because many, many years ago, National Family Mediation was asked to provide the first ever training program for some 40 people from each of these communities throughout the world to come together in London and to be trained as mediators. And I was lucky because I wasn't due to be, I was with 2 other trainers, about 7 altogether, which of course is crazy, 7 mediators. We tried to work. But in the case of families, there were 3 of us, and I wasn't on until day 3. And I could just see by the expressions on their faces, this wasn't ringing true. This wasn't making sense. And that puzzled me. And I talked to a couple of them, and I began to understand the difference. The key word difference is the difference between Western individualist mediation problem-solving methods and non-Western communitarian methods. And so I brought in a new exercise to day 3. So before we go any further, I want you to get in. I want you to tell me, when a couple is sitting in the room with me, who else in the community is going to be freed? And they talked about parents, grandparents, aunts and uncles, teachers, everybody in the community is going to be worried about what happens. And then I said, I want you to get into groups now of grandparents and teachers and faith leaders. And, I want you to decide what your worries are and what you hope will happen. So that went down very well. And at the end of the program, we be debriefing and a big ceremony. We always have big ceremonies when working with these communities. And the man who organized it all, who wrote the review, who wrote the foreword in my first book, Muhammad Bajafsi, came up to me and said, would you mind doing this on your own for us? You know, for the foreseeable future, because it has to be this difference. And so that's the big secret. And it's amazing how people have been saying a lot to me over the last few years about we need more training in cultural sensitivity and cultural competence when we're working. What I tend to do is to say, if the cultural difference between myself and the new people, new referral, is so obvious, such as Muslim communities, travelers communities, or whatever. Now, I just say that there are clearly some cultural issues here, and I'm going to do my best to work with in a way that makes sense to you and your particular culture. And if at any point I'm not doing that, I really need you to tell me. I need to learn from you.
There you go.
How this is working or not. And I'm you know, I'd be grateful if we do that. And so that's my approach to it.
Yeah, and I think that's very valid, because I think there's only so much can be done in training. It's actually life experience and actually mediating but if you're open to learning from your clients as well, that's a really important. And we had to do that with Nigerian clients we had, because they wanted their faith leaders to come into the mediation. They wanted to have prayers before and afterwards. So whatever they needed is what we should be doing.
It's a bespoke, tailored way of working.
Yes.
Constantly asking yourself, is this a message from both of them, or is one more, emphasizing that than the other? But design it. And there's one of the principles in mediation that is very rarely referred to, curiously, is procedural flexibility.
Yes.
We talk about confidentiality, we talk about voluntarism, impartiality. Procedural flexibility. In this situation, I'm getting a message. I need to work differently. I need to let that other person in, that one of the clients wants to bring in. The young woman wants to bring her brother. And I'm going to talk to the other client about how they feel about that, and so on and so on. And that's procedural flexibility, bringing in the grandparents who are more at an age than the parents of the child itself. Procedural flexibility, provided always that it is run through the sieve, the screen of the fundamental principles.
Yes. And I think that's, you have a lovely piece in your book about those fundamental principles, which you also brought into the college itself as part of the fundamental principles of mediation. And I think we're going to go to our last piece, I know we have to go to our last piece, because this is going by way too fast. So we are going to do another one of these, Tony. But the last piece I wanted to talk to you about is sort of future, looking forward. And I suppose I'd start this piece by saying that we all, when I say we all, I mean the whole world, stepped into a new world post-COVID for many different reasons. But in the mediation community, I remember the sheer panic I felt in the first few days of how on earth, we had 21 cases that were live. Yeah. And then with this lockdown, and I thought, well, what are we going to do here? And fortunately, Shane, who comes from a tech background, was immediately, within 2 days, had us up on an online platform, had kind of taught all of our clients how to get there, how to do it. And since then, from my professional practice point of view, most of our clients are asking to remain on Zoom. So for me as a mediator, I actually much prefer it, which most mediators find strange when I say that. Yeah. I prefer it because the clients tell me they prefer it. They find it much more convenient. I can observe my clients much more closely. Like, I've been watching you on screen. I've been watching your shoulder going up when you want to emphasize a point. I've watched when you kind of lean back when you're happy with where the conversation's going. But I can actually stare at them, which you couldn't do in a room, because, and a key point is the clients are looking at themselves. They see themselves, they see their own behavior. What's your view of the online space in terms of mediation?
There's a bit of me that was quite glad that I was retiring when it because I struggled so much, even to have to log into a Zoom with colleagues and to do all of that, and to include bringing out budget sheets and all of that. And I think it is the way. It's the way we are going. If it hadn't happened, so what caused it, then it would have come anyway, I think. And
Yeah,
so
I agree.
procedural flexibility, we're learning to do it differently. And I've done similar things previously by telephone.
Yes.
One client in the room and the other in another country. But no, I think, as you say, as long as you're watching, and you're watching a bit like active listening.
Yes.
You're watching.
You're watching. Yeah, no, I actually I do love it. And I think one of the extraordinary things from a professional practice point of view is that the geographical boundaries went away. And so I'm getting work from all over the world now, or we're getting work from all over the world. And it's no longer relevant where we are, it's what we do. And so, that's the key piece. And I think, and also child consultation, we found that teenagers in particular are so happy to talk to us online, whereas they were reticent about coming into a physical space with us. So I think you're right. I think we were going to go this direction. COVID just fast forwarded the whole piece. So I'm going to take us out of the session, Tony, asking you a big loaded question. What do you hope for the future of mediation?
That we carry on what we're doing and that we never stop. I always say to my trainees, if the time comes when I think I've done it all, got it all, I'll know it's time to hang up my marker pen. So we keep on doing what we're doing. We keep on exploring. We keep on reflective practicing all the time. We keep on challenging each other. And so that, in one sense, I think the other thing that is worrying is that, way back in the beginning, close on 40 years ago, we said our job was to train to help lawyers understand what mediation was about, help judges, help politicians. And we did a lot of good work on that, really did, and we had some funding in order to be the Legal Services Commission. The people we have not reached to this day are the customers. And so to approach the average person in the street and say, what do you know about mediation? They'll say, well, that's the way you meditate. It's the way you think. It's different thing. It's either meditation or it's... And so I think we've got, and I'm going to start work on this right now, in terms of the College of Mediators, is how do we get at the people? And it includes getting into all the soaps. And there were a couple of ones that were done years ago, one in Coronation Street. And it was the most appalling example of mediation you could possibly imagine. There was also a series of programs about mediators, and they use real mediators, and that too. And they unfortunately picked the worst mediators you can imagine. So we're not getting at the public. And I think I'm going to start working on how do you get at the soaps and the people who manage what goes on in any particular episode. How do you get into you and yours every day BBC 4, you and yours? And there's another group called Loose Women, which is, these are brilliant conversations between influential people, and we should be getting mediation in there and better understood. There's slight worry, and it's very contentious, is that we keep working as lead bodies and regulatory bodies in a collaborative way, and that no one organization or lead body attempts to take control. I think that would be absolutely disastrous. It's very tempting. It's very tempting. I'm already seeing signs of it. But it was very, very adversarial in America, and it seriously damaged some of the lead bodies. So that's it. Yeah.
And I think that comes to that mediators are people too, and therefore we have conflict within our own professional space with each other, and we've got to figure that one out. Absolutely. Tony Whatling.
Seriously, we are so seriously not good at conflict in many.
No, we're not.
And I know people say to me, but it's different ways. No, it isn't. We put up a sign saying we're the experts in mediation. Come and see us and pay us, and I've written about that as well. So yeah.
So Tony Whatling, I do think the future of mediation looks bright, so long as we can get our act together as mediators and talk directly to the public, raise public awareness. Thank you for this conversation today. I would definitely like to have another one with you. I think we'll do little pieces if you're up for it. I'm definitely up for it. So thank you again for being a guest of the Irish Professional Mediators Organisation.
It's been a pleasure and a privilege. Thank you for asking me.